Music. It's the love of music that brings us together. The love of music that forms the bond between us. For the next hour, join us for the love of music, presenting those aspects of music which excite, provoke, and inspire. Our host today is David Dubal, WNCN music director, pianist, educator, and writer on music. Here is David Dubal for the love of music.
It's my privilege to have as my guest Ken Furie. Kenneth Furie, as he is known by his byline. Kenneth Furie is former music editor of High Fidelity. He is also a very controversial critic for our own Keynote magazine. And every month he writes about opera, and every month, Ken, I hope you don't mind me saying this, but you infuriate a lot of people, Mr. Furie.
That seems to be the case.
And I think that's wonderful because it's great to have in the world of music something that's happening which is alive. In the August issue, you have a first-part article, 2 parts, August and September, of the 19... What is it exactly, Ken?
19 good opera recordings.
Not great.
Well, they may be great, but the point I wanted to make is that they are at least good, and let's settle for that before we start worrying about great.
Good is not bad. Now, today's program will be very interesting, and I want Kenneth Furie to describe it to you.
Well, thank you, David. It's nice to be here. What we thought we would do would be to listen 3 times to King Philip's monologue from Verdi's Don Carlo, or Don Carlos, depending on which version we're listening to. Actually, we will be hearing both, because the first recording that we're going to be listening to is in the original French. The opera was written originally for Paris and was written in French, although it's virtually never performed that way now. It's always performed in Italian translation. And interestingly, according to Andrew Porter, who knows about these things, Verdi never worked with the Italian text. He revised the opera from 5 acts to 4 for performance in Italy, but even then apparently he was working only in the French text.
Where does this fall in Verdi's output of how many operas he wrote? I'm not sure, 25?
40-odd.
Really?
It's a relatively late work. It comes right before Aida, and at that point Verdi was writing operas at a much slower pace than he had been writing them earlier on. It was, as I said, written for Paris. It was originally a 5-act spectacle opera with ballet. It was a very long piece.
As Paris liked.
There was a lot of cutting that had to be done even before the first performance to make it moderately manageable. Mm-hmm. It's kind of a transitional piece. I think we would consider Aida, Otello, and Falstaff the 3 late operas, and this is the one that comes right before them. It's an opera that has become very popular in the last 20 or 30 years.
How come?
I guess we've become ready for it. It's a very gloomy piece, and there was a time when it was thought that you couldn't have unrelieved gloom.
Yes, that's what held it back, though, right?
Well, that's one of the things. There is a love story, but it's a very unhappy love story, which is not really at the center of the action. The love story is between King Philip's young wife, Elisabetta, and his son, Carlo. The opera is basically about everything going wrong for Philip. Mm-hmm. We have this man who is probably the most powerful man on earth, Philip II of Spain, and nothing is going right for him. He has married the young Princess of France, Elisabetta. The language forms are going to be crazy, and we'll probably have several different languages here. Elisabetta, of course, is an Italian form. Mm-hmm. Philip is an English form, and I suppose we ought to be consistent, but we won't be.
No, not at all.
And originally, in order to resolve the 100 Years' War, the plan was that the daughter of the King of France, Elisabetta, would marry Philip's son, Carlo. And at the last minute, this has changed so that Philip himself will marry Elisabetta. Carlo and Elisabetta have met. That happens in the first act in the French version, which was actually cut and doesn't appear at all in the Italian version. Mm-hmm. Elisabetta and Carlo have met and fallen in love before they discover that Elisabetta is going to marry Carlo's father rather than Carlo. Mm-hmm. Philip is aware that there is something going on between Elisabetta and Carlo, although in fact there isn't anything actually going on. Their feelings have never changed about one another. But the guy really is paranoid. Everything is going wrong. Mm-hmm. He's involved in a bloody insurrection in Flanders, which Spain ruled, and the problem in Flanders was that the Flemings were Protestant, and Philip saw as one of his missions to spread Catholicism. And there was a horrible bloodbath going on in Flanders in the scenes that precede the monologue. Philip has been challenged on things that he's doing. He's been challenged by the Marquis of Posa on the bloodbath in Flanders. Posa, who is a sturdy soldier whom Philip trusts a great deal, has pleaded the case for freedom for Flanders, which Philip will not agree to. But as this monologue will show, that's on his mind. Mm-hmm. Philip believes that Elisabetta and Carlo are having an affair, although we find out later that he's the adulterer in the family, and his own guilt he's projecting onto his wife. Here he is ostensibly the most powerful man on earth, and he's got a grand inquisitor who can overrule anything he does. And right after this monologue that we're going to hear, we see the inquisitor, who is 90 and blind, and still can tell Philip to do anything that he wants. The guy is in very sad shape. This monologue finds him after a large scene, a public burning of heretics. His son has taken arms against him. Philip is alone in his study just before dawn. Light is beginning to come through the windows. And he can't sleep. With all that on his conscience, it's not surprising, but he can't sleep. It's kind of an interesting scene. We do have the most powerful man on earth, and we suddenly see him stripped of any protection. He's all by himself. We're eavesdropping on him, and he begins clearly thinking about Elisabetta, and the monologue begins «Elle a jamais m'amò» in Italian. In French it begins «Elle ne m'aime pas», she never loved me, or in the French, she doesn't love me. He broods about that for a while. He knows that she never loved him. That's his next thought. There's a very powerful visual image. He can recall the look on her face the day that she arrived from France, when she first saw his white hair. It's a terrific image, the fact that he can see this, and it's clearly an image that's haunted him. And one thing that's very interesting, since this monologue is going to present Philip in a rather sympathetic light, much more so than anything that's happened so far, in which he's just a tyrant, here he seems human and sympathetic. But that image of Elisabetta looking sadly at his white hair, I think, is interesting, because from the very moment that she arrived, he knew that she didn't love him, and he married her anyway. So that's his first thought, that she never loved him, her heart is closed to him. Then he wakes from this semi-conscious state and wonders where he is. He notices that the candles have burned out, that dawn is rising. And then he starts thinking about the only sleep that he can look forward to, which is when he will be buried in the crypt of the Escorial, the palace in which he lives. And then comes the famous Dormirò Sol section of the monologue. And then the one time that he sings in full voice, the next shift of thought, is very interesting. It's the only time, as I said, that he sings in full voice, and the thought he voices, if only the royal crown gave me the power to read men's hearts where only God can see. And if you think of that image that he has of Elisabetta looking at his white hair, his problem wasn't that he didn't know what was in Elisabetta's heart. He just never wanted to deal with it. And then he repeats that thought and finally again goes back to the first thought, that she doesn't love me, she never loved me, her heart is closed. I thought we would start by hearing the monologue. I hesitate to call it an aria. It's really much too long.
It's a very long word.
It's about 10 minutes,
yes.
Right, so including the long orchestral introduction, which I think will set the mood far better than I've been able to do.
Magnificently painted this whole subject, a complex psychological drama on a vast scale.
It is really an amazing piece.
Why did you choose these performances? We'll hear three today.
Right. We have three complete performances. The first performance is in the original French, and the singer is a Canadian bass named Joseph Rouleau, and he's not very good. Let's face it, not the world's greatest performance, but it is in French. And so I think it will give us the sound of the original text. Then we will be hearing Cesare Siepi from a recital disc made in about the mid-50s. Philip was one of Siepi's most famous roles. Many listeners will recall that Don Carlo was the first opera that was performed at the Met in Rudolf Ming's regime. In his first season in 1950, it was performed on opening night, and that was Siepi's Met debut when he was very young, and it has remained part of his repertory for almost 30 years. And I'll bet even today he could probably sing it better than the people who are singing it. And unfortunately, Siepi never recorded the complete opera, but he did make this recording of just the monologue.
And we'll hear that second.
That we'll be hearing second. And then we will be hearing the monologue from the most recent complete recording of the opera, which has Nikolai Gyaurov as Philip. And, well, we'll talk about that more when we get to it.
Excellent. And let's begin with the French.
Right. Okay. We have again Joseph Rouleau singing, this is Elle ne m'aime pas, and he is accompanied by the Covent Garden Orchestra conducted by John Matheson.
Let's hear it.
Regardant en silence mes cheveux blancs le jour qu'elle arriva de France. Où suis-je? Ces flambeaux sont consumés. l'aurore argente ses vitraux. Voici le jour. Hélas, le sommeil salutaire, le doux sommeil a fui pour jamais ma on lui ravit sa couronne et sa femme.
Okay, that was Joseph Rouleau, the Canadian bass, singing Elle ne m'aime pas from the fourth act of Verdi's Don Carlos. John Matheson conducted the orchestra of Covent Garden. That performance was in the original French version of the monologue.
Ken, you're a very good announcer.
Does it pay?
Kenneth Furie is my guest, and we will return with another performance of Philip's monologue right after this message. My guest today is Ken Furie, our controversial opera writer for Keynote magazine, and this month he has the first of a two-part article on the 19 good opera recordings that he recommends. I haven't read that yet, but I certainly will soon. Now, we have been discussing a gloomy, big monologue of Verdi from Don Carlo, a work that, as you said, in the last 20 or 30 years has made a much bigger splash in the Verdi output than it once had. The big performance in your mind, obviously, is Cesare Siepi.
Well, of what we've got here, this is the major performance. I don't think it's necessarily...
Why is that, of course?
Well, it's the right kind of voice. Verdi was writing for a very specific kind of bass voice, and Siepi comes closer to filling that bill than just about anybody of the last 30 years. He kept his voice in really very good shape, for more than a quarter of a century, which is quite impressive.
Sure is.
It's a voice that's focused in tone. As we were listening to poor Rouleau, I mean, there are all sorts of phrases, especially on top, where you can hear he simply can't control the tone. Siepi can do that, in addition to which he's a really very sensitive interpreter. It's not fancy, self-conscious interpreting, but he does what any stage performer has to do. He brings the drama to life.
Is this a technically difficult work for the bass voice?
It's not easy. Of course, all that soft singing leaves you very little room to hide. The voice is fairly exposed. The orchestration is fairly considerate. There are difficult moments in the piece. I think probably the hardest thing about it is that it is so slow. And that, well, it's certainly true for a pianist too, that maintaining a slow tempo, you really have to know what you're doing, or people will be tuning out almost immediately.
Absolutely. That's why I always play fast pieces. I mean, so much easier to work on.
I don't think that a young bass would use this as an audition piece for that same reason.
I doubt it, and I understand that for sure. Sustaining that quality of sound, the soft, as well as that great length, is, I guess, one of the real difficulties of this aria.
In addition to which, Philip has an enormous amount of singing still to do in this scene. He has a scene with the Grand Inquisitor.
This is a 5-act job, isn't it?
It's a 5-act job. Philip himself actually is spared the first act, but this is the scene in which he really earns his fee. He's got this whole monologue, and then he has 2 more big scenes immediately following it. So it's a job.
Can we now hear the Siepi?
I would be interested in doing that.
Okay.
As I mentioned, the recording that we've got is from a recital record, since he did not record the complete opera. It's been reissued in the London Treasury series. The orchestra is the orchestra of the Santa Cecilia Academy of Rome, and the conductor is the great Alberto Errede, and the bass again is Cesare Siepi. Okay, that was an Italian language performance of Philip's monologue from Verdi's Don Carlo. The Philip was Cesare Siepi. The orchestra of the Accademia di Santa Cecilia of Rome was conducted by Alberto Errede, and we have yet another performance coming up.
Ken, there is no doubt in my mind now, because I'm a great believer in comparison, not in life but in music, that this was superior to the French singing. We will return with my guest, Ken Furie, right after this message. Kenneth Furie is my guest, and we are discussing one segment from a gigantic Verdi opera, the one he wrote right before the Suez Canal Commission, I believe, right?
Yes, that's what it was.
And it's Don Carlo, and it's Philip's monologue, and this is programmed by Kenneth Furie, Keynote's opera critic, and a darn interesting one. Now, we have had in the beginning, if anyone missed out, that's unfortunate, we had Kenneth discussing this opera in detail, and now we are actually hearing this vast monologue. What's next, Ken?
Okay, what we have next is Nikolai Gyaurov. This is kind of an interesting case, because Gyaurov recorded Philip twice complete, and what we'll be hearing is his more recent recording, which was just released last year. Gyaurov recorded it fairly early in his career, in the mid-60s, and early in his career, he got by on sheer voice, and it was one heck of a voice. And if we had time to hear that, I think you'd be overwhelmed by the sheer sound of it. He didn't do much except produce that sound, but the sound was pretty awesome. unfortunately, singers can't get by all that long on sheer sound. The voice just doesn't produce it any more than a baseball pitcher can get by on sheer speed for more than a few years. And Gyalrov got himself in really serious vocal trouble, from which he seems to have emerged in the last couple of years. And this recording of the monologue is really very nice, but it's a very different sort of thing. He has to husband his vocal resources. It's no longer the kind of instrument that will just overwhelm you by its power. On top, he has to be very careful, and so you'll hear him being very cautious on top, but he's at least managed to make a whole voice out of what he's got left. And I thought what we'd do for this performance, since it is from a complete recording, is run an extra couple of minutes into the beginning of the Grand Inquisitor scene. As I mentioned, one of Philip's problems is having this Grand Inquisitor hanging over him. Immediately after this monologue ends, Count Lerma appears and announces the Grand Inquisitor, and then we hear some really amazing music slithering around in the double basses.
Spooky before to me.
It is spooky. Well, the man himself is spooky. I mean, this is real power. I mean, Philip may be massacring people in Flanders, but that's small time. When you're running a big league inquisition, that's... And he does, in the course of the scene with Philip, reduce Philip almost to tears. So I thought we'd hear just that introductory music and then maybe the first few lines of the exchange between Philip and the Inquisitor.
Absolutely. Let's do that, and will you tell us what orchestra?
Okay, well, we have Gyalrov as Philip. The Inquisitor is Ruggero Raimondi. Interestingly, they have both sung Philip in the current Met production of Don Carlo, and Raimondi had recorded Philip himself. We have the Berlin Philharmonic, conducted by Herbert von Karajan.
dove so tuoi doppier presso a finì l'aurora in bianca il mio verò già spunto il dì ma sorte coi miei giorni renti io sono Dio spari dai miei occhi languore
Okay, we just heard a snatch of The Inquisitor. We've been listening once again to Philip's monologue from the fourth act of Verdi's Don Carlo. We heard Nikolai Gyaurov as Philip, and for one line, Ruggero Raimondi as the Grand Inquisitor. Also, I had to look it up. We heard Horst Nietzsche as the Count Lerma, singing Il Grande Inquisitor, the Berlin Philharmonic under Herbert von Karajan.
Kenneth, well done, and we will be back with my guest Ken Furie, where we will discuss a few more little moments on this problematic opera, Don Carlo. Ken, this opera is almost as bad or maybe worse than Boris, right?
Boris, Don Carlo, and Carmen, I think, are the real growth industries among the musicologists.
Now, we have a minute or so to talk about this. It is practically dissertation material. It's so complex, right?
There are lots of dissertations, and there are scholars really making livings off of Don Carlo.
Really?
Because of the language problem, French versus Italian. There's all the material that was cut before the first performance. There's the condensation from 5 acts to 4. It really is a terrific business if you're a musicologist.
Well, you have certainly helped my knowledge of the monologue from Don Carlo, and we will have another program next week, but it will be quite different. We won't have comparison. We'll have what?
Well, we will have comparisons.
Oh, good.
It's just I've chosen them more carefully. I don't think this will all work the way I'm planning it, but I've chosen some things in which I hope we can listen for specific aspects of singing, with some Mozart and more Verdi. That's always the place to look if you're interested in singing.
He understood the voice.
Yes.
We will be returning next week, and I would like everyone to certainly read Kenneth Furie's article in this month's Keynote, and it will be in the September issue. And I should plug Keynote. I hope you don't mind, Kenneth, but it is our magazine, WNCN's, and your article this month is on 19 good opera recordings.
This month, I think, actually is 8. 8 of the 19, with 11 to follow.
September, then we'll have the other 11. I'll be looking forward to both issues. Kenneth Furie was my guest today, and I thank you for coming, Ken.
Thank you for having me, David.
And this is David Dubal. Thank you for listening.
For the Love of Music, with today's host, David Dubal, WNCN Music Director. We hope you'll be with us when once again we meet to listen and exchange ideas, all for the love of music. For the Love of Music is produced by WNCN New York, GAF Broadcasting Company.